So hi, Felipe, hi, Rosana, and Ricardo. It's a pleasure being here. Thanks to organizers to include me in this program. When Felipe said that this was a challenging model, that was quite an understatement, but I think it was very rewarding to read this paper, and I think I have learned a lot out of it. So the main idea of the paper, as Felipe explained it, is that there are two things that characterize sudden stop in emerging economies. One is this big drop in productivity with a slow recovery afterwards. That looks in the data as those type of trend shocks that have been highlighted in many recent papers. And also there is this current account reversal, also related to a trade balance improvement. And that also is part of an old story about the exchange rate impact of a sudden stop, in which the depreciation tend to favor exports over domestic producers. So the authors are going to analyze these two things together in a model that combines many features and many branches of the literature. It's quite interesting. The key innovation, the key mechanism in this paper is innovation. It's an endogenous growth model in which innovation falls during sudden stops, and that is what is going to account for the slowdown in productivity growth afterwards. But also there is a switching mechanism from domestic to export lines out of this exchange rate mechanism. And this is going to mitigate to some extent the drop in innovation, and also is going to deliver this improvement in the trade balance. So they build this very nice model, and they use Chilean data, firm level data, around the 1998 sudden stop episode in order to validate some of the predictions of the model. So let me talk briefly about the model. This is going to be a very low-tech exposition of it, but I'm going to mix my remarks together with the presentation. So at some points I'm going to say some comments. So in terms of the macro structure, this is a small open economy model with one final tradable goods. As in most of these sudden stop macro models, there is going to be aggregated shocks to technology and combined with shocks to the international interest rate that the country faces. The final good is going to be under perfect competition. There is not going to be much new there, but this final good production requires intermediate goods where most of the action is going to be. And these intermediate goods is going to be important, are also going to be tradable. The final good production is subject to a working capital requirement, and that gives you this external finance dependence that amplifies the impact of the shock or the sudden stop into the demand of intermediate goods, and as such into innovation and the mechanism that comes afterwards. And there's going to be also a productive asset, let's call it land, as Felipe just did, and this serves as collateral, and there's going to be a constraint on leverage. So the way in which a sudden stop affects the economy here is there is a sequence of negative shocks that eventually triggers the collateral constraint, and that reduces the demand for intermediate goods in the domestic market. So that's the part of the macro block. Now, most of the action occurs at the firm product dynamics, and that happens in the intermediate goods part of the model. So the authors are going to refer to these intermediates as product lines. I'm going to refer indistinctly between, there is no distinction really between an intermediate good and a product line in this model. There is going to be a fixed set of product lines that's going to be indexed between 0 and 1, and it's going to be a continuum. Each one of them is going to be produced by the lowest cost producer in the economy or abroad, if you are talking about imports. There is also a continuum of firms, and then the mass of these firms is going to be varying over time because we are going to allow for entry and exit of firms. So there is this mapping between a continuum of firms of varying mass and this fixed set of product lines in 0 and 1, in which each firm has a discrete number of product lines. So I found this interesting, not quite easy, but I think I agree with it. Then the Bertrand competition makes the model tractable, and that says that the leading firm is going to charge a price which is going to be equal to the second marginal cost. And what is going to be new is there is going to be factor saving innovation. And then a firm that innovates can poach or steal a product line from another firm and then becomes the lowest cost producer. This is something that I would like to highlight, and it wasn't that clear in the text. The number of product lines is actually fixed. So there is no an expanding number of varieties. The number of varieties are fixed. So in that sense, when the text says things like entry of a new product, there is not really entry of a new product. Firms entry exit products are just replaced. No, the producer of that is replaced. So I will suggest the authors to be a bit more clear in their language, distinguishing what is firm dynamics and product dynamics, because they are not equivalent in the context of their model. Now, these intermediate goods can be produced both by domestic and foreign firms, and they can be sold in domestic and foreign markets. So that makes the set of these product lines in 0-1, they can be divided perfectly between domestic lines, which are just produced and sold domestically, export lines, which are produced domestically but sold domestically and abroad, and import lines. And the division of this continuum of goods between these three categories depends on who is the lowest cost producer in each market. And importantly, there is a trade cost in order to export or import these intermediate goods. We're going to have innovation at the domestic innovation, and that allows a firm to steal a domestic line or an import line, or export innovation, in which an existing firm transforms a domestic line to an export line and replaces a foreign producer in a foreign market. So the only decision that firms make here is how much to invest in each type of innovation. And then the probability of success depends, this is a very complicated part of the model, the combinatorial probability of success, on the resources invested, which is fine. So if the innovation is successful, they expand the portfolio of product lines, becoming the lower cost producer. If other firms innovate successfully, then incumbent firm might lose some product lines, and this is the risk of replacement. First, with no exit lines, with no lines exit. So 2 additional remarks just about the presentation of the model. I really will have benefited for having a formal definition of an equilibrium model. I know that in the appendix, they list all the first order conditions, but I'm thinking more of a formal definition of the kind of taking as given this and this, agent this does that, no? And then a set of market clearing of equilibrium conditions at the end, and also of a balanced growth path. The other thing about this position, and Felipe already clarified this in his presentation, is what is the exchange rate? No? Because the motivation talks a lot about the exchange rate mechanism, but there is nothing in the model that resembles or that is defined as a real exchange rate. I think they are referring, and Felipe just clarified, to the relative marginal cost between domestic and foreign for intermediate goods, but this should be maybe explicit in terms of the text. So what are the main mechanisms? When we have a sudden stop, there is a decrease in the demand for intermediate goods in the domestic markets. That also reduces factor prices, and hence the marginal cost for domestic firms. Firms are going to respond by cutting innovation, because due to the lower demand, profits decrease, and this slows down productivity growth and the speed of the recovery. And firms are also going to switch their innovation effort more towards export lines, where profits are higher. This partially, but only partially, mitigates the productivity slowdown and contributes to the trade balance. I think that the authors could also be more clear about the extensive versus the intensive margin in terms of the predictions of the model. There is a figure 9 in the appendix that was very, very clarifying for me, but that should belong to the main text. No? So the export growth is happening through the number of product lines or through the sales of each product line, and the same for imports. It seems to me, from what I learned is that the extensive margin is more important for export, while the intensive margin is more important for imports. But that should be more clear in terms of the text. Now, in terms of the data, which is quite a contribution of the paper, they show that the model replicates very well some things. I'm not going to repeat them because Felipe already did. So let me go directly to my remarks. So one first remark that I have is, what is exactly the data equivalent of a product line? What is a product in the data? I think the authors could be more clear about that. It's just adding more raisin to the cereal that transforms it into a new product. And when a new product is introduced, and I'm talking now about the data, is that replacing a similar product of another firm? Is actually an innovation, is an expansion and improvement on the own products of the firms? So this is what I mean by, is there a replacement effect? Is it clear that you are replacing another producer by adding a product line to your portfolio? Then there is also a distinction between so the authors talk somehow indistinctly between the size, distribution, and the number of products. Thanks. So I will maybe try to explore both dimensions. When we talk about size in terms of, for instance, number of workers. So here, number of products is mapped into size in the context of the model, but I don't know how this mapping looks in terms of the data. Firms with more products are also larger or not necessarily. And finally, and this is more of a Santa Claus wish list, is there any data in terms of productivity and innovation effort that could be used to validate not only the channel between the valuation and then the introduction of new product, but about whether that actually brings productivity improvements, and these are actually the result of a measurable innovation effort. So the experiment that they do with the model is to feed the model with what I will call a stylized sudden stop, which is an ad hoc sequence of negative productivity shock and interest rate increase that is trying to mimic the typical sudden stop and simulate the response over time. So there are some aggregate responses that sound right, like a slow recovery of TFP and output, a decline in innovation, and an improvement in the trade balance. But my main remark here is I miss in that part a sort of data model comparison. And in particular, if we're taking Chile as the main laboratory for this model, why not actually reproducing the Chilean sudden stop by using the sequence of productivity and interest rate shock that actually mimic the drop in output and increase in interest rate observed in this episode, instead of using this more stylized sudden stop. The data also shows, and this is, I think, one of the very nicest results of the paper, the data confirms some of the predictions of the model in terms of the drop in the probability of adding new products, especially in the domestic market, and the increase in the revenues and profits for exporters relative to non-exporters. These are two key predictions of the model, and I'm quite happy that these are consistent with the data. I was, however, not so convinced about the financial dependence exercise, in the sense that in the model, at least, the working, maybe I'm taking the model too literally, but the working capital constraint and everything related to this external financial dependence, that happens at the final good level, not to the intermediate level. So somehow this exercise is assuming that products, intermediate goods produced within an industry are sold to final good producers within the same industry. I'm not very clear about how to map this exercise in the context of the model. I will also produce and show more transitions, more comparison between transitions between the model and the data. Again, in the appendix, and I will say this belongs to the text, there is a nice table in which they show in the data what are the transitions from different introduction of goods, exit of goods, and so on in the data. It would be nice to have a table comparable from the model. And again, if something could be provided in terms of innovation and productivity outcome, that would be very nice. So in order to conclude on time, this is a very nice paper. I really like the idea of having reading it towards the end. It was challenging, but it was rewarding as well. It provides a clear contribution to the literature, and it gets a lot of things right. My main point will be that maybe it will be useful, not necessarily because one paper has to get everything right, but it will be useful to see what exactly the paper doesn't get right in order for future research. And I think there are some things about the dynamic of imports, for instance, and about some of the other transitions that are not particularly highlighted in the paper, in which we could see some discrepancies within the paper and the model. But I think that it will be worth learning out of these discrepancies as well. Well, thanks a lot for the opportunity.